Imagine standing before a king, knowing that one sentence could cost you your life. Imagine walking into the center of a kingdom that had forgotten its God, and telling its ruler that the heavens themselves would become silent. No army behind you.
No throne.
No palace.
No wealth.
Only a prophet, and a message. His name was Elijah. According to the biblical account, Israel had entered an age of political power and religious conflict. King Ahab ruled the northern kingdom, and alongside him stood Queen Jezebel, whose influence became closely associated in the biblical narrative with the worship of Baal. Elijah appeared suddenly.
No detailed childhood.
No genealogy explaining his rise. The story simply introduces him, a man from Tishbe in Gilead. And his first recorded act was not a battle. It was a declaration. There would be no dew.
No rain.
Not until Elijah said so. The prophet had challenged the king, and apparently the entire religious system surrounding him. Then he disappeared. A drought began. The land suffered. And somewhere beyond the reach of the royal court, Elijah waited. But this was only the beginning, because soon one man would stand against hundreds. Fire would fall from the sky. A queen would swear to kill him, and the prophet who had confronted a kingdom would eventually collapse alone in the wilderness. This is the story of Elijah. The prophet who discovered that victory does not always feel like victory. To understand Elijah, we first have to understand the world he entered. The kingdom of Israel was divided from Judah to the south. His kings ruled from cities such as Samaria. And during the reign of Ahab, Israel was politically connected to the wider world of the ancient Levant. The biblical narrative presents Ahab's reign as one marked by prosperity, political alliances, and profound religious controversy. Ahab married Jezebel, associated in the biblical account with Sidon. Together, their court became connected with the worship of Baal. The biblical writers portray this not simply as a change in religious preference, but as a crisis of covenant identity. And into this conflict stepped Elijah. We know surprisingly little about his early life. The Bible does not tell us what his parents looked like. It does not describe his childhood. It does not give us a detailed biography. That silence is important, because Elijah enters the story already formed, already convinced, already willing to confront power. He came from Gilead, east of the Jordan, a region of rugged hills, valleys, grazing lands, and difficult terrain. Perhaps that landscape helps explain why later biblical descriptions associate Elijah with wilderness places. But we must be careful. We cannot invent a childhood for him and call it history. What we can say is this: by the time Elijah appears before Ahab, he has already become a prophet, and his first recorded message is devastating. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be no rain. The biblical text then sends Elijah away to the Wadi Cherith. There, according to the account, ravens provide him with food while he drinks from the stream. But the stream eventually dries up. The drought is no longer an announcement. It has become reality. The drought had consequences far beyond the palace. It meant hunger, scarcity, fear. And the biblical story moves Elijah away from Israel to Zarephath. There he encounters a widow gathering sticks. She has almost nothing left. A small amount of flour, a little oil, and one final meal for herself and her son. Elijah asks her to make him food first. It sounds harsh, but the story immediately becomes a story about survival. The flour does not run out. The oil does not disappear. Day after day, the household survives. Then tragedy strikes. The widow's son becomes sick, and he dies. This is where Elijah's story becomes personal. The widow does not celebrate miracles. She confronts him with grief. Her child is dead. Elijah takes the boy upstairs. He cries out to God. And according to the biblical narrative, the child returns to life. Elijah brings him back to his mother. For the widow, the prophet is no longer merely a stranger. He is connected to the return of her son. This episode matters because Elijah is often remembered only for fire, only for confrontation, only for Mount Carmel. But before the spectacular victory, There is a grieving mother, a dying child, and a prophet pleading for mercy. The story is telling us something important. Elijah is not merely a man confronting kings. He is also a man who walks directly into human suffering. And while the drought continues, the kingdom of Israel is approaching its breaking point. 3 years passed. The drought had transformed the landscape. According to the biblical narrative, Ahab and his servant Obadiah searched the land for surviving springs and pasture. Animals were dying. The kingdom was desperate. And then, Elijah received the command to return. The prophet who had disappeared was coming back. He encountered Obadiah, an official in Ahab's household. Obadiah feared what would happen if he told the king Elijah had appeared. But Elijah insisted, "Tell Ahab, I am here." And when Ahab finally saw him, he called him something that would become part of Elijah's legend, the troubler of Israel. But Elijah rejected the accusation. He argued that the true problem was the king's abandonment of God's commands and his following of the Baals. Then Elijah made an extraordinary demand. Bring Israel to Mount Carmel. Bring the prophets of Baal. Bring the people. And let the question be settled publicly. Not in a palace. Not in a secret meeting. On a mountain. Before everyone. The conflict was no longer hidden. Mount Carmel became the stage. On one side, Elijah. On the other, the prophets of Baal. The biblical account describes 450 prophets of Baal being gathered. The people watched, and Elijah asked them a question that remains one of the most famous lines in his story. How long will you waver between two opinions? The question was not simply about ritual. It was about allegiance. Who would Israel follow? The Lord or Baal? Elijah proposed a test. 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. Each side would call upon its deity. The God who answered by fire would be recognized. The prophets of Baal went first. They shouted. They called. They continued for hours. The biblical narrative describes increasingly desperate behavior. But nothing happened. No fire. No answer. No sign. Then Elijah stepped forward. He repaired the altar of the Lord. He arranged the sacrifice. And then, he made the impossible even harder. Water was poured over the offering, again and again, until the altar and surrounding trench were drenched. Now Elijah prayed, not a long speech, a direct appeal. Let the people know who is God. And then, fire. The biblical account describes fire falling from the Lord. The sacrifice burned. The wood burned. The stones and dust were consumed. Even the water in the trench disappeared, and the people fell to the ground. Their cry echoed across the mountain. The Lord, He is God. For Elijah, this should have been the greatest victory of his life. The challenge had been answered. The people had seen the sign. The drought was about to end. But the story does not turn toward celebration. It turns toward judgment. Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal seized. The biblical text says they were taken to the Kishon Valley and killed. This is one of the most violent passages in the Elijah narrative. It should not be softened, but it should also not be sensationalized. For an accurate documentary, present it as an ancient religious and political conflict described by the biblical source, not as an instruction or model for violence today. Then Elijah turned toward Ahab. The drought was ending. He told the king to eat and drink, because rain was coming. But Elijah himself climbed higher. He bent down. He prayed. He sent his servant to look toward the sea. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. 7 times. Then, a tiny cloud appeared. Small. Almost insignificant. But it was enough. The sky darkened. Wind rose. Rain began to fall. The drought was broken. And according to the biblical account, Elijah ran ahead of Ahab toward Jezreel. And then, Elijah received a message. Jezebel wanted him dead. The same man who had stood before hundreds ran. The same prophet who had faced a king fled into the wilderness. He went toward Beersheba. Then he traveled farther. And eventually, he sat beneath a broom tree, and he wanted to die. This is perhaps the most unexpected moment in Elijah's story. Because the Bible refuses to portray its heroes as invincible. Elijah was exhausted, afraid, alone. His great victory had not eliminated danger. It had increased it. He had expected transformation. Instead, the threat remained. And now the prophet could go no farther. He lay down and slept. Then, according to the biblical narrative, an angel touched him. Food, water, rest. Then again, food, water, rest. The message was not a lecture. It was care. Get up. Eat. The journey is too much for you. There is something profoundly human about this scene. The man who had called fire from heaven needed to sleep. The man who had confronted a kingdom needed to be fed. And the man who had seemed fearless was terrified. Elijah traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. There he entered a cave. And then came the question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" His answer reveals the emotional depth of the moment. He believed he had been completely faithful. He believed Israel had abandoned the covenant. He believed the prophets had been killed. And he believed he alone remained. But the answer he received was not what he expected. Powerful wind came, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a quiet sound. Silence. Elijah covered his face. And once again, the question came, "What are you doing here?" This time, Elijah received his next assignment. His story was not finished. He was told to return. And he was told to begin preparing the next generation. A man named Elisha would become his successor. The lesson is striking. Elijah had believed the story depended entirely on him. But it didn't. There were others. And there would be others after him. The prophet who thought he stood alone was never truly the end of the story. Elijah's conflict with Ahab was not finished. One of the darkest episodes came through a man named Naboth. Naboth owned a vineyard near Ahab's palace. The king wanted it. Naboth refused to sell. The biblical story then describes Jezebel arranging a false accusation against Naboth. Naboth was killed, and the vineyard became available. Ahab went to take possession, but then Elijah appeared. Once again, the prophet walked directly toward power. Not because the king was stronger, not because Elijah had an army, but because the prophet believed the king was accountable. The message was devastating. The bloodshed surrounding Naboth's death would not simply disappear. This is where Elijah becomes more than a miracle worker. He becomes a voice of moral accountability. The story presents kings as powerful, but not absolute. Palace does not make injustice right. A crown does not erase responsibility. And wealth does not turn theft into justice. That idea is one reason Elijah's story continues to resonate. The prophet stands outside the machinery of power and tells power that it can be wrong. Ahab eventually died. His son Ahaziah became king, and Elijah remained active. When Ahaziah sought answers from Baal-zebub after an accident, Elijah intervened. The king sent soldiers, and the biblical narrative records dramatic confrontations between Elijah and those who came to arrest him. But the final chapter of Elijah's earthly ministry is not about a palace. It is about a journey. Elijah and Elisha traveled together. They passed from one place to another. And each time, Elijah told Elisha to remain behind. Each time, Elisha refused. He would not abandon his master. Finally, they came to the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, struck the waters, and the river divided according to the biblical account. They crossed. Then Elijah asked Elisha what he wanted before Elijah was taken away. Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Then came the extraordinary scene, a fiery chariot, fiery horses, and Elijah was carried upward in a whirlwind. Elisha saw him disappear. His master was gone. But the mission continued. Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak and returned toward the Jordan. The prophet's story had become a succession, a legacy, a passing of responsibility from one generation to another. Elijah is remembered as a prophet of fire, But fire is only part of his story. He is also the prophet who experienced exhaustion. The man who stood before a king and later collapsed beneath a tree. The man who confronted religious power and then questioned his own purpose. The man who thought he was alone and discovered that his story would continue through someone else. That may be the most important part of Elijah's legacy. Not that he was fearless, but that he continued despite fear. Not that he never broke, but that he got back up. Not that he changed the entire world in one day, but that he remained faithful to his calling. The biblical story presents Elijah standing against kings, false worship, injustice, and political power. But it also shows something quieter, that a widow surviving, that a grieving mother receiving her child, that a tired prophet being fed, that a successor being prepared, and a legacy being passed forward. For modern audiences, Elijah's story can be understood as a story about conscience. What happens when one person refuses to surrender truth to power? What happens when everyone else remains silent? What happens when victory does not immediately solve everything? And what happens when the hero discovers he is not the only one? The story of Elijah does not end with the fire. It continues through the people who remembered him, through the prophets who followed, through generations that read his story, and through the question he placed before an entire nation. Who will you follow? Maybe that is why Elijah still feels so powerful. Because every generation eventually faces its own moment, when standing alone feels easier than standing for what it believes is right. And in those moments, the story of Elijah asks us to remember, courage is not the absence of fear. Sometimes, courage is simply refusing to run forever. If the story moved you, subscribe for more cinematic biblical history, forgotten ancient stories, and full-length historical documentaries. And tell us in the comments, what moment from Elijah's story would you want to see turned into a full cinematic scene?